Chapter 5 is called Arithmetic. We are once again in the Wormwood household. We have an exchange between Mr. Wormwood, who is loud as always and brash, and with his son Michael, who is just very, very ordinary. And there is Matilda there in the background who tries to include herself in this conversation. And it describes what unfolds, what happens from her trying to be a part of this conversation. And then finally we have Mrs. Wormwood, who continues to be a bit of the antithesis, the opposite of what the narrator is engaging and is trying to portray as the right values that one should have in terms of intellectualism and hard work and so on and so forth. Let's carry on. Chapter 5 opens with Matilda ruminating, that means thinking about how she longed for her parents to be good and loving, which at the beginning of the book, the narrator clearly describes as what parents generally are towards their children. So we know, and every time, every chapter, it builds on the fact that Matilda's parents are negligent and unkind and really are very detrimental to her, as in terms of parenting, they are very negligent. But, however, in this process, in this hardship, Matilda has now found a tool in order to fight the injustices of her parents. So we're going to read this passage over here. So, being very small and very young, the only power Matilda had over anyone in her family was brain power. For sheer cleverness, she could run rings around them all. But the fact remained that any 5-year-old girl in any family was always obliged to do as she was told, however asinine the orders might be. Thus, she was always forced to eat her evening meals out of TV dinner trays in front of the dreaded box. She always had to stay alone on weekday afternoons, and whenever she was told to shut up, she had to shut up. Her safety valve, the thing that prevented her from going round the bend, was the fun of devising and dishing out these splendid punishments. And the lovely thing was that they seemed to work, at any rate for short periods. The father, in particular, became less cocky and unbearable for several days after receiving a dose of Matilda's magical medicine. Now, let's look a little bit in this passage at the vocabulary and expression. So you have asinine, which comes from ass, which is a donkey, which is known to be not a very intelligent animal. So however asinine the orders might be, you're going into, again, how Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood, instead of encouraging their daughter, and how parents can just tell their children to do this, do that, no matter how foolish and annoying it is, the children just have to do it. So asinine means a little bit like dumb. Dreaded box. Again, we have how the narrator is always referring to the TV, the telly, and the dreaded box is the television, and it's dreaded because to dread something is to hate it, it's something terrible connotations around it. So the dreaded box, it refers to the television. A safety valve is what you use to release tension or negative emotions. So, for example, a safety valve might be laughing. If you're feeling very, very stressed, that maybe you say, I need to watch something really funny, and then you feel better afterwards. Or a safety valve can be a hug from someone that you love when you're feeling ill at ease. Round the bend, when someone sends you round the bend, it means it drives you nuts. It drives you, again, another expression is to drive you nuts, is to drive you crazy. Essentially, makes you feel mad. Dishing out these splendid punishments is an example of the way that Roald Dahl uses these terms of phrases. They are not splendid punishments, it's sarcasm. They are terrible punishments, and dishing out means, giving them out. You dish things out by giving things out like this. A magic medicine, is it magic medicine? No, but it's a nice way of receiving a dose of Matilda's magic medicine. It's a magic medicine for the parents to make them be a little bit nicer, or at least not so horrible. So we have Matilda here. After she's played a few tricks on her parents, as we've said, there's the hat and glue incident, and then there's stuffing the parrot up the chimney, which is a ghost. So by frightening them, or by really embarrassing her dad with the glue and hat incident, we have her way of finding justice. Now, the narrator is very clear that as a little girl, Matilda and all little girls, unfortunately, need to abide by the rules, need to do as they're told, and cannot fight back. So now, in a normal household, that's already annoying enough as a small child to have to put up with being told to do this, that, and the other. Now, what's worse is, of course, in Matilda's household, she is so much more intelligent than anyone in her household. And so for her, it is far more infuriating. It is probably enraging to have to deal with parents like hers, and her sense of powerlessness is what makes her feel even more enraged, especially knowing how daft, how silly her parents are. Now, also, what these tricks do, they do a number of things. So, number one, they show us, the readers, even though the family doesn't know that these tricks are hers, but it shows the reader and allows Matilda to show how clever she is. And she obviously is very clever by being able to devise these tricks at the age of 5. And what's interesting is that they also do change the parents' behavior somewhat, even though if it is not permanent, even though it's not a drastic change, you still have an element of change. And so there's an effect, there's a little bit of justice, and justice not in the kind of legal go to court and get an outcome, as in, yes, Matilda, you are right and your parents are wrong, and so your parents have to pay you this and that, for instance. No, what it does is it keeps Matilda sane. It's what they call cathartic, as in also the reader is able to feel the sense of justice that Matilda gets out of playing these tricks on her parents. And the narrator insists that it is a relevant way of getting justice, even though it is not all encompassing, even though it doesn't end the way that they act, though it does bring Matilda, as she puts it, some sanity, or stops her from going round the bend. What happens next in the chapter is that Mr. Wormwood comes back from a brilliant day at work where he has successfully made lots and lots of money. He comes in as usual, dressed ridiculously, and described as being very loud and cocky, and basically brags, shows off about how many people he cheated, how, and directs this conversation to his son only. Now, what happens next is that he then brings out a sum and he tells Michael, come, write it down and let's go over it so that you learn how to do, you need to be able to make these sums because you're going to inherit my business. And you need to be a great businessman like me, essentially, so you need to be able to make these sort of sums. What happens next is Matilda tries to intercede and gives the answer, right? So she's obviously terribly clever, and we have Mr. Wormwood speaking about high finance, which is basically what he thinks him and his son are doing in terms of his business right there. He also in this sense, actually, it's interesting because Mr. Wormwood shows that he does value education, however, only in terms of it contributing to his business and him being able to understand how to make money. Then what you then have is Mr. Wormwood in dictating the different sums to his son, says, I have the answer, and his son goes, wow, he goes, do you mean you did it in your head, Dad? The son asked, goggling. So Michael is going, wow, you did all that sum in your head. And Mr. Wormwood says, not exactly, nobody can do that. And of course, when Matilda, from the corner, very quietly tells her father the answer of the sum, and it turns out to be right, this infuriates Mr. Wormwood. So, and this is what we have. This is the passage that I've chosen. Don't give me that rubbish, the father shouted. Of course you looked. You must have looked. No one in the world could give the right answer just like that, especially a girl. You're a little cheat, madam, that's what you are. A cheat and a liar. This is so very wrong in so many ways, and that is it's a dramatic, it's a very crushing response to Matilda, who is quietly showing her genius and wants to participate in her father's conversation with her brother, but every time she is pushed away, and then when she brilliantly comes up with the answer to this sum, Mr. Wormwood there's so many things here. So number one, it's extremely sexist. Sexist being the fact that the father doesn't want to think that a girl, especially a girl, can't come up with this answer. And also, so he's thinking, you obviously read it, impossible, Matilda could not have read it, but he's saying, you obviously read it, you are a liar, you are a cheat, and a girl couldn't have done that. And this ties up with earlier in the chapter where Matilda is brushed aside by her father because this is only boys to this men to discuss this. It's only Michael who will inherit the business, and the narrowness in that is in that Matilda is obviously so much more intelligent than her brother, so much more intelligent than anyone in her household and far beyond, but her father cannot see past that. And this ties up with how we see Mrs. Wormwood in the very next in the next paragraph, as she hasn't been in the scene at all, but she comes in right at the end, which is a huge contrast to Matilda, but also supports this attitude that that the author brings up in Mr. Wormwood of what women are, and essentially versus Matilda and her pursuit for learning. Mrs. Wormwood now comes in after an exhausting afternoon of bingo. So she continues to portray all the negligent characteristics of a good parent, but also these the idea that she is a woman who basically just relies on her husband and has not educated herself, has not tried to improve herself, and also does a pretty bad job as a parent as well. So these are all the elements of negligence, lack of development, lack of self development, intellectualism, and the end result is in this. Let's read this. At that point, the mother came in carrying a large tray on which were the four suppers. This time it was fish and chips, which Mrs. Wormwood had picked up from the fish and chip shop on her way home from bingo. It seemed that bingo afternoons left her so exhausted, both physically and emotionally, that she never had enough energy left to cook an evening meal. Now, you must know fish and chips are a very common, extremely common meal that you can get in England. It's mostly should be cod in batter, fried with chips. In terms of nutrition, it is what it is. It's not phenomenal. And it's essentially fast food. And as you can see in the picture, you can often get it from the chippy in a newspaper. They literally wrapped in newspaper that absorbs the oil, and that's a nice thing for you to see, because that's how you would see it in the UK in many places. Now, what all of this means is Mrs. Wormwood is emotionally, physically and emotionally exhausted from playing bingo. Now, I'm sure you know bingo is a very common game amongst old people. It is not something that you should come back exhausted from. It is about, someone calls out a number and you find out whether the number is on your sheet or not. The fact that Mrs. Wormwood comes back exhausted and unable to cook even her TV dinners, which basically are no great nutritional dinner, and instead gets fish and chips, just goes to show her continued negligence towards her family and her indifference towards them. There is this lack of nutritious food it shows the lack of emotional depth, the intellectual lack of intellectual stimulation or understanding of what makes a good meal, a caring household, and so on. The parents are simply focused on making money and going through the motions of family life as a chore, as in, okay, let's get this done, family meal in front of TV, let's go. And of course, this is a huge contrast to Matilda, who now has a much better sense of what time should be spent doing in terms of the value of what she wants to put into. So she knows already at a very young age, at the age of 5, that she'd rather be upstairs reading her Dickens, reading or any sort of other literature that she's so passionate about, rather than sitting in front of telly watching some silly show that they don't even care what it is, as long as they are sitting, eating, and going through, as I said, these motions of family life. So there's a huge contrast between, again, Mrs. Wormwood, all of the family, and Matilda and what she values and how she is growing as a person.